From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast series about South Carolina culture and history with a nod to all things Southern. Today, Alfred Turner and I will be talking with Courtney Tollison Hartness about her new book, Our Country First, Then Greenville, a new South city during the Progressive Era and World War I.
In her book, Courtney explores Greenville's home front experience of race relations, dramatic population growth, the women's suffrage movement, and the contributions of African Americans and women to Greenville history.
We'll talk about how Greenville's changes during World War I served to generate massive development in the city and the region. It was this experience that catalyzed Greenville's development into a modern city, setting the stage for the continued growth that persists into the present day. Well, Courtney, it's great to have you back with us, and we're talking about your latest book, Our Country First, Then Greenville, a new South city during the Progressive Era and World War I. Let's deconstruct your title. You're talking about World War I, which is certainly an era, and then you're talking about the Progressive Era, which, if you have to define it concretely as a historian, depending upon where you live, is something of a challenge. How did you get involved with this particular topic?
So in the summer of 2014, a student of mine at Furman, Donnie Santa Catarina, and I started to research Greenville's experience during World War I. We wanted to understand Greenville's contributions to the war and also the ways that the war impacted Greenville. And we thought, surely by 2016, early 2017, we'll have a book put together, and then by the 100-year anniversary of the end of the war in November of 2018, we'll have a book out. And what we realized was that this was a much larger story, and that the war was a very important period in Greenville's evolution into a modern and thriving city. But it was just one component of that evolution, and that the Progressive Era, from 1880s to through the 1920s or so, contributed so much to this as well. So it became a much larger story than we had anticipated, and that's the reason why it took 9 years of research and writing to get it out.
When you think about the Progressive Era in America, the 1880s to 1920, you usually think about the Midwest, the Northeast, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and in fact, Senator La Follette said of the American South, there was no progressive movement in the American South, which you and I both know was hogwash. But several times you referred to a historian of World War I who said it's important to look at what was going on in the local community because most World War histories ignore that unless you happen to be living in London or Istanbul or Paris or Washington.
I was greatly influenced by that. I'm a public historian in addition to academics. And then, of course, I focus a lot on South Carolina history, and I focus a lot on the history of Greenville. And so I was familiar with the extent to which the war and the Progressive Era impacted this community. We had a training camp, Camp Sevier, here in Greenville. Spartanburg had a training camp. Columbia had a training camp. And the experiences of bringing, 100,000 soldiers in for training into a community. I mean, the camp population was larger than the city population. I knew the impact of this. And I also think it's just extremely interesting for people to know about what happened in their communities and how these huge global events impacted places that still surround us, buildings that were on Main Street, the Camp Sevier site that some folks up here in Greenville are trying to turn into a park. It's fascinating. And to some extent, even for the students and for students I teach and for K through 12 as well, it makes something that's so massive, World War I. Sometimes it's more manageable to start at the local level and to talk about how people's lives were impacted. And so I often seek in my research to look at what was going on locally with the community and also with local individuals. There are some fascinating personalities that I discovered
Well,
throughout the process of research.
an outsider might say, well, we know how Greenville got prosperous. All the textile mills came there in the 1890s and the turn of the century. Textile mill story is an important part of Greenville's development. But Camp Sevier, with, as you said, 100,000 soldiers, that economic boost to the city of Greenville was really significant.
It was incredibly significant. It was very much a local partnership. Greenville had the state's first Rotary Club. Names like Joe Serene, Alistair Furman were involved with this. And Joe Serene had actually served with Leonard Wood of the United States Army. And Leonard Wood was in charge of the Southeastern Division in terms of selecting campsites throughout the region. They were extremely close, dating back to their experience together in the Spanish-American War. And Greenville was awarded a campsite, and it was very much a partnership. Greenville provided the land, but the benefits were incredible. I mean, the road development, military highways, some of the first paved roads in Greenville, the water systems had to be improved, electric lighting. And then, of course, World War I was a war in which wives and families often traveled with their soldier in training. And so there was a tremendous housing shortage because not only had, 100,000 soldiers at the camp, but you had their family members, loved ones coming to Greenville and renting every spare room available and eating in restaurants and shopping in stores and traveling on public transportation. So you're right; it was a economic boom for the community.
And these folks were literally from all over the country. They weren't local Southern boys that were being trained here.
All over the country, and beyond the economic impact, the impact of diversification, because a lot of them came here and liked Greenville and wanted to stay. In fact, Greenville County set a new record for applications for marriage licenses the week before Christmas of 1917. And so many of the young men who came here for training married local women and returned here after the war. So there was a population boost that occurred after the war as well.
Well, people usually associate a famed division with Camp Sevier. What was that?
Oh, the 30th. Yeah, the 30th, it had been a National Guard division comprised of men from Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and the Carolinas. And they trained here in Greenville at Camp Sevier and then were sent overseas. And they are credited with breaking the Hindenburg Line in late September of 1918, which was really the last German defenses to be conquered, and they're credited with having done so. So Greenville takes a lot of pride in having served as the site for their training. And after the war, we continue to host members of the 30th Division for annual reunions for several years into the 1920s.
When you talked about things that changed because of Camp Sevier, roads, waterworks, sewer system, those are things that you also associate with the progressive era, because when you think about the progressive era, 1880 to 1920, such things as good government, clean drinking water, public libraries, civic clubs, all of that is considered progressive. So I'd like to kind of dig into the progressive part of this, because Greenville really is a good example of a town where change did happen even before Camp Sevier.
Absolutely. And that's really what occurred. When I started this research, there was this fluidity that you just referred to between the impact of having this camp, this World War I training camp, and other aspects, other goals, objectives, aims of the progressive era. You mentioned infrastructure, but another goal of the progressive era was to move beyond sectional animosities lingering, from the Civil War, and to heal these national wounds and to promote a reconciliation between Northerners and Southerners. We're talking about a period 50 years after the end of the Civil War, and we just talked about the people who came to Camp Sevier and the relationships, the marriages that resulted from this, men from all over the country. And so the war had a major impact on moving Greenvillians past the sense of localism and regionalism, and in bringing Greenville back into the national fold. Greenvillians, white Greenvillians we're referring to for the most part, really started thinking of themselves, as Americans again, as opposed to just Southerners. It's been well established that a lot of white Southerners did not celebrate the 4th of July in the decades after the Civil War.
That was true in South Carolina for almost 50 years after the end of the Civil War. The only section of the population that celebrated the 4th of July was the African American population.
Right. White Southerners thought it was a holiday for African Americans and for, Yankees. And what we saw here in Greenville, whites had been celebrating Confederate Memorial Day, and white Southerners continued celebrating Confederate Memorial Day. But the 4th of July, 1917 in Greenville was a huge event. And it's really the first time that the white community here embraced that holiday on a humongous scale. And same thing with Labor Day. Just a few months later, these celebrations, the parades involved the nationalism, the patriotism involved all this, occasionally caught, national attention because these displays of nationalism and patriotism are occurring in South Carolina, the first state to secede.
Wasn't there a film taken of either that celebration or something else, a celebration by the 30th Division? An early film was made of that?
Black and white, silent video footage of the reunions from the 30th Division can be found in the South Carolina room at the main Greenville County Library, Hughes Library. And I've seen them, and, there's so many people who flooded into Main Street and downtown Greenville. The entire community, embraced these men. I mean, it's on the heels. It's a year later, after the war, but it's also very much part of Greenville's strategy, to modernize and to improve their city and to create another economic base for the city. So in the 1920s, Greenville, it had a lot of nicknames, mostly developed by the Chamber of Commerce, but one of them was Convention City because they had hosted so many, not only conventions, but, reunions and other gatherings here. There was incredible hotel development. We had the infrastructure in place with Textile Hall to host these conventions and huge gatherings of people.
Just to step back from this for a second to something you were talking about earlier, the fluidity of the progressiveness, if you will, of that part of South Carolina, how that momentum was already there to some extent before Camp Sevier. Is there a person or group of people that we can look back and say they were sort of at the nexus of that energy, pushing Greenville in a more progressive direction than, say, Columbia or another part of the state?
Yes, and they're largely associated in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s with the textile industry.
Mm-hmm.
One important point that needs to be mentioned was that Greenville had experience hosting a military training camp. Civic leaders recruited and hosted a Spanish-American War training camp, Camp Weatherhill, located very close to downtown Greenville today. So they knew the economic benefits of this. And these textile leaders and civic leaders and Chamber of Commerce leaders and people who got the cotton exchange going and all this, they were very driven. They were very taken with this New South boosterism, and they had a very strategic vision. They wanted to be seen as progressive.
Well,
the Chamber of Commerce had a lot of very
this was the pearl of the Piedmont, right?
Yes, it was, it was the Athens of the upcountry. That was a moniker given to it from a guy who was stationed here right after the war ended. Then it evolved to the Pearl of the Piedmont, and then the textile capital of the South, textile capital of the world, some would say. They also called it Progressive Greenville. There was a monthly magazine published by the Chamber of Commerce and the title of the magazine was Progressive Greenville. And they also referred to the Greenville spirit, which is essentially, the local commitment to progressive causes in the 19 teens and 1920s.
Okay, let's look outside the economic sphere of the Chamber of Commerce. The folks who were behind better parks, better education, health care, particularly for women. This, in many cities, was really the woman's sphere of the progressive movement. And when you talk about progressivism, frequently women are left out of the picture, and certainly African Americans are left out of the picture, because progressivism in the South, whether it was in Columbia or Atlanta or Mobile or wherever, it was for white folks only.
I really wanted to be sure to place women and African Americans at the center of this story, and they are very much at the center of the story. This is the first, published account of the women's suffrage movement in Greenville, and I look so much at progressive causes that were largely dominated by women. So, it starts with temperance, Women's Christian Temperance Union, Greenville chapters, South Carolina chapters, Greenville women's involvement with that. And then Greenville had clubs fairly early on for club women, and these affiliated with the General Federation of Women's Clubs. And then you move into the suffrage movement in 1890. Virginia Durant Young came up from the Low Country, and Viola Neblett, a Greenville woman, hosted a small group of about a dozen people, at least one man, mostly women, and they founded the South Carolina Equal Rights Association here. And so you start to see a lot of progressive era activity associated, with women occurring very early on. Women were also very involved in lost cause memorialization of the Civil War. And one aspect of this that I found so interesting, Walter, you mentioned earlier that some scholars have said that there was no progressive era in the South. Certainly the maintenance of segregation was not something to be challenged at all. These white Southerners were absolutely committed to white supremacy, and they were involved in progressive causes that are very common mainstream progressive causes nationally as well, like temperance, like suffrage, like the club movement. I looked at African American women's involvement in the club movement as well. And then, you get to the war, and women were absolutely central. African American and white women were absolutely essential and central to this story. You mentioned civic beautification, parks, literacy, healthcare. There was so much that evolved, and there were certainly currents that supported this before the war, but the war, especially in regards to healthcare, the combination of the war and, of course, the Spanish influenza pandemic really ignited so much growth for local healthcare. There were 5 hospitals and health clinics that opened in the 1920s alone.
When you researched this, I know you had access to, the Greenville newspapers were very active. You had rival newspapers, so you had a good overview of what was going on. What about diaries, letters? And again, we're really trying to get access to women and particularly African Americans. What kind of materials did you find?
The South Carolina room at the Greenville County Library has a lot of great information on women's clubs, and I found some great master's theses coming out of USC that had been written. They were dated, but they've been written about the history of the women's suffrage movement. I had to get pretty creative with African American history. Doing African American history in Greenville can be a challenge. Doing African American history, in the South, 100, 150 years ago.
Well, I think we need to also let folks know that unlike most of the rest of South Carolina, we need to remember when World War I comes around, South Carolina is still a majority African American community, is a majority in the state, but not in the area around Greenville. The African American community is a smaller portion. So in many ways, you see the picture in Charleston or even in Columbia where there's a large African American community. In Greenville, it's just a very small group.
It is. The demographics, the racial demographics in Greenville are different. The upcountry racial demographics are different from the Midlands and the Low Country, and it does make this research a bit more challenging, but it was something I was really committed to. And I spent 9 years trying to find alternative sources. Other communities in South Carolina had African American newspapers. That was something Greenville did not have. So I looked at African American newspapers nationally. The Chicago Defender, for instance, ended up being a great source for me. And then even with African American club women, I looked at their records, and the overwhelming majority of the leadership and also the membership for African American club women was from the Midlands and the Low Country. But I'd occasionally find a little tidbit here and there about a Greenville club. And to my knowledge, no one's ever done any research in this way on African American club women, in Greenville. I found a picture of a woman I longed to see what she looked like in South Carolina Library in their African American club women records. Hattie Williams, she was chair of the Colored Auxiliary for Women of the South Carolina Council of Defense, the Greenville County chapter. She had made an incredible impact on this community. And so, that's just one example of something I was able to find. Beyond that, I often went into North Carolina and Tennessee records, and I was actually able to find some journals and diaries that I was able to use as sources.
Well, you mentioned that in terms of progressives in the South, but particularly in a place like Greenville, segregation was never challenged. That was a topic you didn't get into. Also, you didn't question what was going on in the mills. Now, you may have had some progressive mill owners like Parker, and then, of course, the famous Mr. Hollis working with programs in the mills, but you didn't question child labor laws. You didn't do anything like that because that was, prior to Camp Sevier, the economic backbone of the city.
Absolutely. What I found was that there was this dedication to the lost cause and a dedication to the maintenance of African American subjugation enmeshed within progressive causes. Some of these suffrage leaders across the state, went to the South Carolina Constitutional Convention in 1895 and tried to have educational and/or property requirements written into the new state constitution, with the idea that if women were given the right to vote with qualifications attached to it, that white supremacy in the state, would be assured. I found so many examples of women who served as leaders of local chapters and also at the state level of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And they're also leaders of their local equal suffrage club, and they're also the leaders of the various, part of the club movement, various clubs in different cities. They didn't see any type of contradiction between the maintenance of white supremacy and also these progressive causes. In fact, with the City Beautiful movement that really comes into Greenville 1904, 1906-ish, there was a Greenville Municipal League that was started, and a study was commissioned by these landscape architects out of Boston. And so they put this study together of Greenville, and it had a master plan in it for parks and other aspects of civic beautification. And there were recommendations embedded in this regarding beautification that the city council in 1912 used to pass what were considered the most stringent residential racial ordinances, segregation ordinances in the country. And this is all being done in the name of progress. So progress was a guise sometimes for formalizing segregation.
Courtney, your title, which is in quotes, Our Country First, Then Greenville. What's the origin of that?
I love the story behind the title. So Greenville had several collaborations with the federal government in various ways. One of the successful collaborations was that Greenville was selected. It was one of a handful of cities across the nation that was selected for a U.S. sanitary survey. And they did all kinds of research on privies and modern sewage and all kinds of things. And Greenville celebrated with a health day. This was a huge community celebration. The Chamber of Commerce also used Health Day to unveil Greenville's first electric sign. In the Chamber of Commerce, this had been an effort that local school children had been involved with. The entire community had raised money for this sign. And the sign read, "Our country first, then Greenville." And this went up in 1916. 3 or 4 years into this research, I just couldn't shake, my fascination with the words that Greenvillians chose before the United States entered the war. I mean, it would have made a lot more sense if this went up after the United States entered the war, because it's, very nationalistic, very patriotic. But this went up in 1916, and it really does show the extent to which Greenvillians had already begun to embrace much more of a national mindset, and it's also representative of their aspirations, their economic aspirations. They knew that they had to move beyond localism, regionalism, because of the heights to which they aspired economically. And so I was taken with this, and then I hopped on eBay, and I was always looking for old Greenville postcards. I'd never actually seen a picture or an image of this electric sign, but I was scrolling through eBay looking for Greenville postcards one day, and I saw something pop up that I'd never seen before, and it was a color postcard of downtown Greenville, and the sign was right there. And I knew at that point in time that this book had, not only a title, but a cover image as well.
I have to sort of state the obvious here, but listening to this conversation, at the very beginning of what we were saying, we started talking about how South Carolina in particular, people were not celebrating the 4th of July before World War I. And we were sort of, if not the center of the myth of the lost cause, we were certainly very important in promoting that. And in 1916, so close to the end of the Civil War, they choose to say, "My country first." That's remarkable.
I thought so as well.
One of the many contradictions and conundrums about studying South Carolina history.
It makes it interesting.
All right. Courtney, Alfred's giving me the wind-up sign. Any last words you'd like to share with our listeners before we close down?
This A.V. Huff has been a mentor to mine, and he's wonderful. And he published a history of Greenville in the mid-1990s. And certainly there have been smaller, published material that's come out since then. But this is the first truly, academic study that's come out on the history of Greenville. However, it's written as much for lay people as it is for other scholars. And I'm thrilled to have it out. I'm thrilled to make this contribution to Greenville history. And I'm also really, really proud that women and African Americans play such a central role in this story.
Well, I'm glad that you wrote it for everybody. If you wrote it just for scholars, you might have only a handful of readers, which sadly too many historians write only for their fellow historians. They don't think about the men and women in the street. And you wrote this for the folks of Greenville, and it is a wonderful window into a world of over a century ago.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us today on The Journal. I hope you enjoyed today's journal. I know that I did. It's always a pleasure to talk with Courtney Tollison Hartness, and that was especially true today because her book, Our Country First, Then Greenville, tells the story of a very important time in the history of one of South Carolina's major cities. It's a story about the impact of World War I, the massive growth in its population, and of the diversity of these newcomers to the upstate. And it's the story of the progressive influence of the women's suffrage movement, as well as the efforts of African Americans and women's groups to advance the civil, social, and economic welfare of Greenville. In her book, Courtney has told us a very important part of South Carolina's history.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio and its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org on the SCETV app, as well as your favorite podcast provider.
Many of the books we talk about on Walter Edgar's Journal are available at All Good Books in 5 Points in Columbia, South Carolina.
We'll talk again soon.